The blizzard came like it had a personal grudge against Eli Carter's ranch. By dawn, snow swallowed his dead fields and half-buried the last 3 cattle he owned, their ribs showing like accusations in the white. On the coldest Christmas Eve he'd ever seen, Eli stood in his doorway, staring at a world that had stopped giving him second chances. His wife was buried under that same hard ground. His children were upstairs pretending not to be hungry, and in 2 weeks, the bank would take what the drought hadn't already stolen. If you're listening to this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. These frontier stories keep riding as long as you stay in the saddle with us. Eli tightened his jaw and stepped back inside. 4 tin plates waited on the rough table, laid out like a promise he couldn't keep. A handful of beans, the last of the flour, water so thin he couldn't honestly call it broth. That was Christmas breakfast. He heard the loft creak, heard his youngest whisper, "Do you think Santa can find us in all this snow?" He didn't have the courage to answer. Instead, he did what desperate men do when there's nothing left to sell but pride. He reached for the rifle hanging by the door, thinking about hunting in a storm that could kill a man quicker than hunger. That's when he heard it, wagon wheels grinding over ice, slow but steady, coming up the lonely track no one used anymore. Eli's fingers froze on the rifle stock as a single wagon rolled into view, driven by a woman in a dark coat, hat pulled low, her braid dusted white with snow, like she'd ridden straight out of the storm itself. He didn't know it yet, but that stranger had come carrying more than food. She'd come with a choice that would set his whole future on fire. The blizzard came like it had a personal grudge against Eli Carter's ranch. By dawn, snow swallowed his dead fields and half-buried the last 3 cattle he owned, their ribs showing like accusations in the white. On the coldest Christmas Eve he'd ever seen, Eli stood in his doorway, staring at a world that had stopped giving him second chances. His wife was buried under that same hard ground. His children were upstairs pretending not to be hungry, and in 2 weeks, the bank would take what the drought hadn't already stolen. If you're listening to this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. These frontier stories keep riding as long as you stay in the saddle with us. Eli tightened his jaw and stepped back inside. 4 tin plates waited on the rough table, laid out like a promise he couldn't keep. A handful of beans, the last of the flour, water so thin he couldn't honestly call it broth. That was Christmas breakfast. He heard the loft creak, heard his youngest whisper, "Do you think Santa can find us in all this snow?" He didn't have the courage to answer. Instead, he did what desperate men do when there's nothing left to sell but pride. He reached for the rifle hanging by the door, thinking about hunting in a storm that could kill a man quicker than hunger. That's when he heard it, wagon wheels grinding over ice, slow but steady, coming up the lonely track no one used anymore. Eli's fingers froze on the rifle stock as a single wagon rolled into view, driven by a woman in a dark coat, hat pulled low, her braid dusted white with snow, like she'd ridden straight out of the storm itself. He didn't know it yet, but that stranger had come carrying more than food. She'd come with a choice that would set his whole future on fire. Inside, Lila moved like she already knew the map of his kitchen. She dumped beans into a pot, slid ham into the oven, shook flour into a bowl with quick, sure hands. "Luke, you're tall. Fetch that tin of salt from the top shelf. Jesse, I saw kindling stacked under the porch. Bring it in. Annie, you sit right here and tell me when you can smell the ham." She gave the smallest child the most serious job, like it mattered as much as any grown man's work. The room woke up around her. Fire roared back to life. Steam fogged the window. For the first time in months, the cabin smelled like something other than fear and cold ash. Eli hovered near the doorway, feeling like a guest in his own house. This, laughter, movement, a woman humming as she stirred gravy, belonged to the life he'd buried with his wife on the hill. Lila shoved a tin mug toward him. "Coffee," she said. "Strong. Sit before you fall." He did, hands wrapping around the heat, like it was the first good thing he'd touched in weeks. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "You barely know us." She didn't meet his eyes. "That's not true," she said. "I've watched your kids in town, watched your wife smile when you weren't looking, watched you try to hold up the sky with your bare hands." Her mouth twitched. "Figured it was time somebody brought a post or two." Luke laughed at that, startled and bright. Annie giggled, peppermint sticks staining her lips where Lila had pressed one into her hand. Eli's chest ached in a new way, like something frozen was starting to crack. When they finally sat at the crowded table, steam rising off plates heaped higher than the children remembered, Lila reached for their hands. "Let's say grace," she murmured, "for food in winter, for stubborn men who think they're alone, for the chance to prove them wrong." As Eli bowed his head, he realized this wasn't just a meal. It was the first crack in the wall he'd built around his heart since the day he buried his wife. The day after Christmas, the storm broke, but the cold stayed. Lila was already at the stove when Eli woke, hair down in a long black braid, sleeves rolled to her elbows, frying leftover ham with potatoes. The sight hit him harder than the coffee. For a half second, his sleepy mind thought Sarah. Then reality caught up and left something sharp and guilty in its place. "Morning," Lila said, not looking up. "Your kids are starting to remember what full feels like. You should see Jesse's face when he thinks no one's watching." If you're still listening to this story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next on this lonely little ranch. They ate together, comfortable, like they'd been doing it for years, instead of a single miracle day. After breakfast, Lila shrugged into her coat. "I'll head back," she said lightly, "before town decides I've bewitched you." The joke didn't quite reach her eyes. "You'll come back?" Eli asked, more desperate than he meant to sound. "Kids will be expecting more of those peppermint sticks." She hesitated, gloved hand on the doorknob, snow glare bright behind her. "Do you want me to?" she asked. Not the children, him. Eli thought of the empty months before, of the banker's deadline, of the way Luke's shoulders had dropped when Lila handed him a second helping without making it a big thing. He thought of how easy it had been to breathe with another adult in the room. "Yeah," he said finally. "I do." Lila's mouth softened. "Then I'll be back for Sunday service," she said. "Somebody's got to make sure you don't fall asleep during the sermon." 4 days later, when she climbed down from his wagon in front of the church and slipped her arm through his on the icy steps, every eye in town turned like rifles finding a target. Eli thought drought was the harshest thing he'd ever faced, but the looks that followed them down that aisle made him realize people could be colder than any winter wind. The sanctuary felt smaller than Eli remembered, the air thick with whispers that pretended to be hymns. No one said a word to them, but that said plenty. Mrs. Hargrove's mouth pinched so tight it nearly disappeared. The Henderson boys snickered behind their hands. Only the pastor's wife offered a trembly smile as Lila slid into the pew beside Eli, and Annie promptly climbed onto her lap like it was the most natural thing in the world. The sermon that morning was on charity and judgment, but every verse felt like it had their names carved into it. Afterward, as soon as they stepped outside, the distance became open. Neighbors who'd once shared coffee with Sarah suddenly remembered reasons to be elsewhere. Eli felt Luke stiffen beside him. Jesse's jaw clenched. Annie's fingers dug into Lila's coat. "Ignore them," Lila murmured. "They've never known what to do with a woman who doesn't ask permission to breathe." That afternoon, Luke came home with a split lip and blood on his collar. "Tommy Henderson said Miss Boone was a bad woman," the boy muttered, eyes burning. "Said only a desperate man would let her stay." He swallowed. "So I hit him." Eli cleaned the cut in grim silence while Lila stood by the doorway, hands fisted at her sides. That night, when the children were finally asleep, she began packing her things, saddlebag, gloves, the scarf Annie liked to play with. "I should have left after Christmas," she said quietly. "I brought you food and trouble in the same wagon." Eli's stomach dropped. "So, that's it?" he asked. "You drive out of our lives because a few cowards in nice coats can't mind their own business?" "Because your son bled for my reputation," she snapped, then winced. Softer, she added, "I won't be the reason they suffer more than they already have." Eli watched her tie that braid with shaking fingers and knew he was about one cowardly breath away from letting the best thing to touch this ranch in years walk out into the dark alone. He found her in the barn, lantern throwing soft light over the set of her shoulders as she checked the wagon harness with more force than necessary. "Why did you really come here, Lila?" he asked, voice low. "And don't tell me it was just extra harvest." She didn't turn. Because your kids were hungry, she said. Because I had more than I needed. The truth, he pressed, stepping closer. Ice creaked on the rafters. Lila's breath misted in the cold as she finally faced him. Because I was tired of eating alone at a table meant for 6, she admitted. Because every Sunday, I watched families walk out of that church and go home together while I went back to a house that echoed. Because I saw you on the street trying to sell your saddle for half what it was worth just to buy flour, and I thought, if I'm capable of helping and I don't, what does that make me? Her laugh came out rough. They call me strange anyway. Might as well be strange and useful. Eli stepped so close, he could see the tiny flakes of snow caught in her lashes. You're not strange, he said. You're the only person in miles who had the guts to show up when we were drowning. His heart hammered against his ribs, loud enough he was sure the mare could hear it. Stay, he said, not because we need a cook or because town needs gossip. Stay because this house feels right with you in it. Because my kids sleep easier when you're here. Because His voice cracked. Because I'm tired of standing in doorways alone. Lila shook her head, eyes shining. You don't know what you're asking. Yeah, he said softly. I do. I'm asking for a partner, not a ghost to fill a chair. You said you didn't want any man. You wanted someone who sees you. Well, Lila Boone, I see you clear as daylight. The word he didn't quite manage to say yet hung between them anyway, warm and frightening as a live coal. Love. They stood there, breath ghosting in the cold, his hands empty, hers full of reins and reasons to leave. You could wait, she whispered. Find some younger widow the town approves of. Eli huffed out a humorless breath. If you think my biggest worry right now is whether Mrs. Hargrove approves of my choices, you haven't been paying attention. He reached for her gloved hand, curling his fingers around hers. Marry me, Lila. The words came out quiet, but steady. Not for convenience, not because I need someone to stir a pot, because I want you here when the next storm hits and when the first wildflowers show up, because my children already look at you like you hung the moon over this ranch. Lila's lips parted. Eli, say no if you don't want me, he said, but don't say no because of them. He jerked his head toward town, miles away, but still too close. We can build something that doesn't belong to their opinions. A small sound came from the barn doorway. Annie stood there in her too big nightshirt, Luke and Jesse peering over her shoulders. Are you leaving? Annie's voice trembled. I don't want you to leave. Lila's composure cracked. She dropped to her knees, pulling the little girl into her arms. Luke cleared his throat. If you're waiting on our vote, he muttered, cheeks red. I think you should stay. Ma would have liked you. Lila flinched at that, then looked up at Eli, tears spilling over. You sure about this? She asked. I've never been less alone in a decision, he said. Say yes, Lila. We'll weather whatever comes. Her shoulders sagged. All right, Eli Carter, she whispered. Yes, I'll stay. The children's shout shook dust from the rafters as he pulled her into his arms, snow spinning around them. Years later, working that same hard land together, he'd remember how the drought ended for good the night one lonely woman chose his broken little ranch and refused to ride away.